then without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Dustin Jaber to start his presentation on Shariati and social theory and post-colonial theory. Yeah, floor is yours, Dr. Bird.
Today, what I want to talk about in terms of Shariati is the dialectical method, or the dialectics of history and the dialectics of religion, in more particular, that one can find within Shariati's work. For me, my first exposure to Shariati was when I was doing my master's degree, and I ended up writing a book about Ayatollah Khomeini. And part of the book on Khomeini was about Shariati's influence, not necessarily his direct influence on Khomeini, but his influence on society that Khomeini himself was able to utilize, that he was able to somehow appropriate into his own critique of the Shah and of the Shah's relationships with the United States. And one of the things that struck me is that Ali Shariati was a supreme dialectician. I mean, we talk about Hegel and Marx and the Marxists, the leftists that come after him, which of course Shariati in many ways studied, especially when he was in Paris. But he appropriated in many ways a dialectics from that type of philosophy. And my argument was not that he somehow borrowed it from the West and brought it into his own work, or brought it to the Muslim world and brought it to Iran, but he somehow made manifest that which was already latent within the Islamic tradition, especially within the Shi'i tradition. And what I tried to formulate in that work was the Hussein model of religious activism, or in many ways non-religious activism, and the Hussein model of religious activism, which I said that I argued Shariati followed. And it really was this difference between an active political engagement in the Hussein model and a quietist position in the Hussein model. So, or in the Hussein model. So, in the Hussein model, religion can be characterized by a few different principles. So, number one, that religion is somehow a stabilizing force. And this is the context from which Ali Shariati grows up, and where religion within Iranian society helped stabilize society. It helped perpetuate social statics. So it reproduced itself. It reproduced the tradition in such a way that it didn't change fundamentally the society, but rather kept the society close to what it was with each passing generation. And that is, in many ways, it's routinization of Ali and Hussein in the authority that they have passed into the tradition. And that authority was basically reproduced to stabilize society. So social statics was one of the defining characteristics of the Hussein model. The Hussein model is also anticipatory in the sense that if change happens, it will happen eschatologically, right? Not small minor changes, but large changes. A radical transformation of society will happen eschatologically through the coming of the Mahdi, right? And so when you have a population that is waiting for that transformative moment to happen, they're waiting for it to happen by this particular eschatological individual, this messianic individual. And therefore what that does is it removes responsibility for radical social change from the population, from the body of believers, unto an individual. Marx's critique of religion as the opiate of the masses is also very much a fundamental characteristics of the Hussein model, in the sense that it reconciles the believers to the overall conditions of the given society. In reconciliation with them, it provides some kind of comfort. It provides some sort of way of living with the conditions as they are, even if they're horrible, even if it causes much suffering. People can take some kind of consolation in the religious tradition in and of itself. So society, the way it is in this type of perspective, is divinely ordained as such, right? And therefore the faithful have no charge to transform society, right? And not in any type of real structural way. Another defining aspect of the Hussein model is that it's dogmatic, right? That dogmatism becomes a fundamental pillar. So you can think that while the Shi'i tradition allows for internal discourse, debate, the overall tradition holds authority and allows for very little transformative change or even reinterpretation of it. Even Khomeini, as I wrote in my book, waited for his predecessor's death before he would enter into the political realm. I mean, he had positions on the Shah, he had positions on what was going on in Iranian society with Khabzadegi and everything else, but he never really made it public until his predecessor's death, because his predecessor was a devoted quietist that wanted him to remain quiet in an advisory role as opposed to active in the public sphere. And so it was a reproduction of these dogmas that Khomeini was doing, and of course Shariati would challenge that. The problem, of course, that I think Shariati saw with just the reproduction of these dogmas is that dogmatism allows for the continuity of tradition, yes, but it ties believers to those dogmas without allowing them to activate them or translate them or reinterpret them in such a way that they can address very modern problems. And therefore the tradition in its static form can become dysgenic. It itself can be a cause of a lot of social problems because it can't transform, because it can't meet the challenges of the day. And because it fails to address those conditions, it somehow becomes a handmaiden of, let's say, a tyrannical state, as we had with the Shah. The last of these characteristics is the Hassanic religion, as I call it. In a Hassanic religion, in this way, offers an interpretation of reality, but it offers only a quietist orientation of action. So if we take a very broad definition of what religion is, you could say it's an interpretation of reality and an orientation of action. Sometimes it's connected with a divine being, sometimes it's connected to multiple divine beings. We don't need to go into the definitions of religion. We know what kind of a quagmire that is. But the Hassanic religion is a quietist religion, right? It's a religion of reproduction of the status quo, wherein the internal discourses of the religion remain ghettoized, if you will. The real discourses are in the debates between scholars. They don't breed or let's say bleed out into the to the main population. What the population has to do is simply accept the basic dogmas and reproduce them and be good and faithful to them. And so religion isn't a force for massive or radical or transformative change under a Hassanic model. Now the Hussein model, as opposed to the Hassanic model, is very different. This is the model that Shariati really brings to the fore in Iran. And that is religion as a dynamic force, right? It rejects the stabilization or religion simply as a pattern maintenance subsystem, right? It rejects stabilization because stabilization somehow perpetuates injustice, right? I mean, people always talk about we have to have peace, we have to have peace. But when you have peace within the conditions of an unjust society, you're simply stabilizing injustice, right? And the Hussein model completely rejects that reproduction of the unjust status quo. The Hussein model is not only based on routinized authority, but it's also charismatic authority, to go back to the Weber tradition. And that is that individual has some sort of routinized authority, right? It might not be the case so much in Shariati, but it would be the case with Khomeini. But also he has charismatic authority, and that is he has, or is perceived to have, special gifts, right? And maybe in Shariati, the case of special gifts is that he could formulate, right, a revolutionary Islamic perspective more so than anyone else possibly could. And he could translate it to the population, to the people in such a way that they could understand it, right? I mean, we have to remember that so many of his quote unquote books are actually speeches, right? Because he was in many ways a teacher beyond he was a theorist sitting down and developing theories, but he was a teacher. And those theories came out of that discourse that he constantly had with his students and with his audience. And there was a perspective that here is this scholar, unlike any and all scholars, that is deeply entrenched in the Shia tradition, yet he's somehow making manifest all these latent elements that are there. He's not borrowing them from the West, right? They're there already, but he's bringing them up to the fore, right? More so than anyone else did at that time. So he has that kind of charismatic authority. And that charismatic authority, interesting enough, in many ways is based in taqlid, right? In emulation. But emulation of who? Not a blind emulation of, let's say, the clerics or whatnot, but an emulation of Muhammad, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, Ali alayhi salam, and Hussein alayhi salam, right? These people, that's who he's emulating, right? And that's who he's drawing the people back to, right? To look at, this is how they dealt with their situation of tyranny at their time, right? They didn't do it through quietism. They didn't do it just simply through making salah faithfully 5 times a day or whatever, right? They were active. And you see that with Shariati, that he's active. So he's engaged in this taqlid of the primordial sources, right? The very beginning sources of the Islamic and Shi'i tradition. So it's, in that case, it's social dynamics over social statics, right? It's not anticipatory like the Hassan model, right? The conditions of the world and conditions in Shariati's time of the Iranian state, the responsibility to change those conditions were left with the people, right? Very democratic in that sense, as opposed to messianic. You know, it's more like we have to construct a society that the Mahdi could endorse, as opposed to we have to wait for the Mahdi to come and create that society. But we create the society that the Mahdi can endorse, right? To somehow maybe prepare it, right? And so it's not anticipatory at all, but responsibility for the transformative structural change lies with the people. Of course, that we all know what that meant during the revolutionary period. That meant that a lot of people would bear the ultimate price for taking on the responsibility of transforming society, and that is they would be martyred, right? But of course, even martyrdom can be revolutionary, and oftentimes it is. So his form of the Shi'i tradition is against what Marx assumed about religion, which of course Marx was just simply following Feuerbach. But the Shi'i tradition, especially the way Shariati translated it or interpreted it, was not opiate, but forgive me, it was Viagra. You know what I mean? It wasn't dulling the senses. It was, alerting the senses. It was what Kant calls in his book, Religion Within the Bounds of Mere Reason. It sharpens the contradictions and sharpens the consciousness. It doesn't dull the consciousness. It actually makes people more aware of the contradictions within society, more aware of the oppression that's in society. It allows them the ability to articulate and to understand what the very structure of society is that creates these problems for them, that creates their suffering, so they can see that the horror and terror that they're dealing with is actually not necessary. It's not part of, or not necessarily part of the human condition, but something that's being manufactured by the way we organize society, right? And so, his reinterpretation or thinking about the Shi'i tradition makes people much more aware of the class conflict that was going on within the Iranian society. And as well as, the exportation of Western culture into Iran, the blind following of it, that, within the concept of Gharb Zadegi, on and on, what type of political role that had in somehow captivating the mind and preparing people for domination from the outside, right? I mean, in the neo-imperialist domination, in the sense that you didn't have American soldiers occupying Iran, but American force was very much a part of what Iran was, in, let's say, in the 1970s. I mean, we have to remember that over 50% of all American military exports in the 1970s went to Iran. Right? I mean, when I tell my American students, they're like, why would we do that? They want to kill us all. I mean, you would be surprised how many times I hear that. And like, well, in the 1970s, slightly different perspective, you know. And so Shariati, by him calling out these things very openly, very publicly, that allowed people first in the Mashad and then the universities to listen to him, understand, get a better understanding of what's going on behind the scenes. And then, of course, that becomes much more popular language, popular discourse, those arguments when it gets taken up by Ayatollah Khomeini. And we have to remember also that Khomeini was asked numerous times by other clerics to condemn Shariati, and he refused. He refused. It didn't mean he agreed with everything Shariati was saying and writing, but he refused to condemn them because, at least according to Bakr Moin's biography, Khomeini said, I can't call them un-Islamic, his ideas. Right? And a lot of these ideas were coming, like I said, were influenced at least from Western philosophical tradition. And he said they're not un-Islamic. So he found a way to bridge the ideas between Western philosophical thought and the Shia tradition in such a way that even the very conservative Ayatollah Khomeini couldn't say that they were un-Islamic, right? Now, the last part is that, last characteristic of the Hussein model is that it reorients dogmas in that sense that the overall beliefs of the Shi'i tradition remains, but they're reoriented, they're translated differently, right? The latent radicality, as I talked about earlier, of the Shi'i tradition is made manifest, and it goes through a process of tajdeed, of renewal, right? Renovatio in Latin. It gets renovated. It's the same house, but it's different now fundamentally somehow, right? So the truth content of the dogma is preserved in Shariati's tradition, but the form, if you will, even the false form, the quietist form, is somehow negated when he's able to make this bridge, when he translates and reorients the Shi'i tradition. Now, talking about Shariati today briefly, and this is the last thing I'll say, it's interesting when I teach Shariati in my Islamic tradition courses, students tend to have the idea that he is a fundamentalist, or he's an extremist. And it's certainly not the case by any stretch of the imagination. He's not, you know, I would say astaghfirullah if I had to say he's like bin Laden or something like that, you know, the supreme intellect versus the guy just who has a lot of money and puts it towards his position, right? But he does not fundamentally reject otherness, right? He's not xenophobic at all. He's open to learning from all perspectives, from all peoples, which is a problem that, you know, in the Muslim world, where people would say, well, this is not Islamic, then we can't have it. You know what I mean? We should reject it. We have it in the Western world too. You know, what can we learn from these Muslims? You know what I mean? They don't teach us anything, you know. That same perspective is not the perspective of Shariati. He doesn't insist on a homogeneity of thought and praxis, right? He's not retrotopian in any kind of way where he thinks that the answers to the problems of the Ummah today are all in the past. Right, I hear from a lot of my friends who are more Wahhabi oriented who will say Ibn Taymiyyah, Ibn Taymiyyah, Ibn Taymiyyah. Everything is Ibn Taymiyyah. We have to go to the past, right? And that's not Shariati. He's ready to learn from the past, but it's a future-oriented remembrance, right, with a practical intent to bring about structural transformation to alleviate unnecessary suffering and horror and terror, right? And so he doesn't insist on the homogeneity of thought and praxis. He does not demand blind obedience to authority, clearly, right? He did not advocate violence against innocents to forward political goals, right? Certainly he advocated for revolution, but revolution was very much surgical. There was an enemy. It was the Shah. It was Savak, right? It was the ruling elites who were perpetuating this type of abuse of the masses. So it wasn't this blind, you know, attack on people. What he advocated for was a socially conscious form of religion, not religion as some kind of healing balm for all of our little existential problems, but one that was infused with social consciousness, that looked for structural change to the damage being done to the ummah, as opposed to just simply individualistically falling back into religion as a way to soothe our souls, right? So it had a social function, a social benefit. We'll say this relativity is especially important, right? Meaning that it's relative to the society he believed in, that religion or a socially conscious form of religion is relative to the society he lived in. Because if we ask ourselves, you know, I as a Westerner steeped within the Islamic tradition, living in the heart of the empire that's in decline, right? That's my current condition. You know, what relevance is Shariati to us, right? And for me, my perspective is that Shariati was precisely what he was within the Iranian context. His religiosity was beneficial to the Iranian context. His religiosity wouldn't be beneficial to the Western context, right? Especially not in the US that pretends to be religious, but really has a lot of disdain for religion from its very beginning, right? But it pretends to be religious. That doesn't mean, though, we couldn't learn from Shariati at all, right? The question is, how can we translate Shariati's social consciousness form of thinking, right? His political engagement, his economic engagement that comes through a religious language. How can we translate that into a secular language that could be beneficial for the West? And for me, that's one of the things that my project, my working and my thinking about Shariati brings me to, is not to simply utilize him, but Americans, by and large, don't know who Shariati is. That's, you know, even American scholars. I mean, I could poll my whole philosophy department that I got my PhD in, who's Ali Shariati, and none of them would know, I can guarantee you, right? Yet I think he could be a very influential person in the West if his work can be translated into publicly accessible language, secular language that could be appropriate and non-alienating to Western scholars, of course. How that gets to the American people, this type of stuff, good luck, right? I mean, that is the difficult thing to do. We won't even listen to our own philosophers, let alone a philosopher with some kind of unpronounceable name from Iran, right? But nevertheless, that's where I'm going to try to, you know, that's where my work is right now. What Shariati could mean to the West. Could he make a contribution, his thinking, make a contribution to Western society? Could it somehow bring a different kind of perspective to the way Islam is practiced here? Because the Islam is practiced in the United States really not in a very public way. The only people that are very public about their faith in the Islamic tradition in the United States are Muslim women. That's because they're visible with their hijabs, right? But Muslim men generally do not make any public statements or don't show their religiosity very often, right? I think that's something Shariati would reject. I think Shariati understood that the Muslim was supposed to be different, not just look different, but be fundamentally different in a good way. And that is something that I think is worth continual discourse and investigation with. So with that, I'll stop talking and I'll hand it back over to my dear brother Ismail.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bird, for the informative talk. It was quite captivating, especially the part on how Shariati is a supreme dialectician. And the Hassanic and Husseinic models were also quite new and informative. I think we'll go with the Q&A once we are done with the presentation. So shall I invite upon Dr. Mehdi Shariati to present?
Good morning, everyone. From here, anyways. Good afternoon, good evening. You know, every time I have to talk after Dustin. It seems like I'm just speechless. I don't know what to say. It seems that he pretty much covers all the angles and leaves me with practically nothing. However, I can maybe try to, because of his the limited time, maybe I can expand on some of the concepts, some of the issues regarding Shariati. And I was expecting something of a much deeper philosophical presentation by Dustin. But then again, I thought, okay, so why don't I just balance that by maybe go into some data about, colonial history. And then, of course, from that, we look at Shariati and how he saw the world in the early 60s in France as he was engaged in the anti-colonial struggle and in support of Algerian anti-colonial war. And so, and I thought, since it is I guess the title presentation today is post-colonial, and I have some difficulty with that concept. But however, the more I read about it, of course, the more I understand where some people are coming from when they present post-colonial studies, post-colonial theory, even. And on the theory side, I'm not sure I understand what that means, but post-colonial studies, certainly I have no problem with that. A few days ago, we celebrated Thanksgiving in this country. Thanksgiving, of course, one of the symbols of colonial expansion of Europe into the Americas. And of course, we don't really have a day that says, well, this is the smallpox day in which we murdered millions of Native Americans deliberately, right? Or Columbus, the man who allegedly discovered America, had this practice, which was later learned by King Leopold of Belgium, and that was to cut off the ears of 5-year-old and 6-year-old who did not meet their quotas in bringing silver. They're working in the mines. So the murder of people took many forms, not just outright killing of them, but infecting their blankets with smallpox, but also killing them in the mines. Millions died from 1492 to about, what was it, 1600. I think the population dropped to about 5 million from hundreds of millions in South America, in particular, Central America. And that, of course, forced these colonists really to import slaves from Africa, because the population was so low that they could not really meet the demand of the mines and the agriculture and other activities, so they had to bring in slaves. The point being that this is the first Holocaust in human history is called the Colombian Holocaust. That's the first one. It's called, sanitization of that is called, in a sanitized word, it's called encounter, or the discovery of America, but actually, more and more resembles a Holocaust, a genocide that the Native Americans really suffered immensely at the hands of the colonialists. And then, of course, we have, in Latin America, of course, we have now the post-colonial studies of post-colonial theory, and their emphasis is primarily, in fact, one of them is very open, explicit about the fact that when we talk about Europe, we don't include Spain and Portugal. I'm talking about Enrique Dosso, the greatest respect I have for the man. He's just incredible. He's put out so much stuff on theology of liberation, on transmodernity, on post-coloniality, and of course Eurocentrism. Now, going to Africa, of course, Africa is an entirely different circumstances in Africa. The scramble for Africa, which began in the 1840s, was from the beginning and continues up to today, what one dimension that has continued throughout this history, and that is violence and dehumanization of Africans, deculturalization of Africans. In this regard, we see, of course, that in Africa, it wasn't just the colonial soldiers, the settlers armed to the teeth, trying to take control of the African land, but also it was the religious institutions and the educational institutions. It was they fabricated the stories about Africans in the process of dehumanizing them. For instance, cannibalism. When I was doing my dissertation, I came across, research that they delved into this idea of cannibalism. Where does that come from? But then they found out that when these colonialists were going into the African villages and with their intentions known to the Africans chased them out of the village. And then, of course, then they concocted the story that these Africans were after us to eat us. And then, of course, they sent that to Europe, the metropoli of Europe, and they put it in their textbooks and they taught that to their children about Africa. And that's what really cannibalism. It's not to say that ceremonial cannibalism didn't occur. It certainly occurred occasionally here and there, perhaps, but not to the extent that it was presented to the Europeans by these settlers. Again, in the form of journalists, missionaries, teachers, soldiers, etc., etc. And the brutality of the Belgians, I mentioned the Columbus's practice of cutting ears in Belgium, in Congo, up the latter part of the 19th century, they cut off hands if these people did not meet their quotas in bringing and working in the rubber field. So that is a tradition. It's a violent tradition that continues, and today still we see in some parts of the world. Not just by Europeans, by others, of course, because that is a learned really practice. And the French, of course, in Algeria, the story well told. The Germans, I don't know if you know, they killed about 100 million people, 100,000 people from 1890 to 1904. The Germans recently admitted that there was a genocide there in killing Heraros and Namas in Namibia, what is called now. Then it was called South Africa. In India, we do know that this, by the way, in Africa, one thing that they did as part of the dehumanization process, removing their identities from them, was that no longer the kings were called kings, they were called chiefs. Now, you don't have the right to call your leader kings, they call them chiefs. That was exclusively a European title. And in India, of course, the British rule, again, I think we're all familiar with that, from mid-18th century to middle 20th century. India suffered immensely at the hands of the Brits. It was impoverished. Its resources was drained the way that the resources in Africa were drained. If you look at the map of Africa by the 1950s, you see a road from the mines to the ports. That goes to show really the degree of development that the Europeans were interested. And in Indonesia also, we still have the same thing. The whole country was owned by Dutch East India Company. When the company went bankrupt, then of course the Dutch state decided that, well, we're going to take control of this piece of land, this property. I was an exclusive with their property, and the treatment, of course, they got. Again, millions died. And in 1945, when Indonesians were pushing for independence, the Dutch were debating whether to grant that or not. And it took 5 years, the end of 1949, that Indonesians became independent, of course. And then after that, a story that followed was interesting. Indonesia was a model in some cases in terms of internationalism, anti-colonial, into the Bandung Conference, anti-colonial campaign that was a model for the rest of the colonized world. So in all of these cases, we see that now the literature is very clear that their disdain for colonial practices for the brutality of colonialism, for dehumanization process and deculturalization process. And that's really what Shariati becomes important in the so-called post-colonial literature, because what Shariati looked at is that there is this lingering coloniality, there's this lingering colonialism, the side effects of colonialism that perhaps is much more dangerous in the long run than colonialism itself, because colonialism, you got an enemy, you can see it, you can feel it, you can touch it, you can kill it, right? Shariati was never mentioned any act of violence, by the way. He emphasized primarily awareness, conscientization, that is, let's make people aware of their condition, of their culture, then let them decide. So in this case, Shariati becomes an important, I guess, model for post-colonial, because the emphasis is not just attacking the Western brutality and et cetera, et cetera. It has its place. There's no question about that. And he was well aware of that. But the question for him was, so what are the internal forces facilitating this lingering colonialism? And Dustin pointed out, Shariati decided to rescue the culture and religion and history and the humanity of the Iranians and others. Although Iran has never been any part of any kind of official colonial apparatus, it wasn't never colonized, but certainly, in terms of intervention, pretty much the end results were pretty much the same, minus perhaps some of the violence. So Shariati then looks at deculturalization. What are the mechanisms by which deculturalization occurs? And so again, Dustin pointed out that he mentions Heidegger, mentions Hegel, Marx, et cetera, well familiar with Western philosophical and social thought, but then he doesn't believe that those are the models for the Iranian society or similar societies. Therefore, he says, we have resources to rescue this culture. In other words, let's remove the years and years of sediments sitting on top of these cultures. Let's look at our own history. Let's look at the concepts that we have to see if there are any use. And that's precisely what his criticism was of the intellectuals of his time. That, look, these people take these things and translate, and they present it as if these were novel ideas I've never heard. For instance, one example in the class structuration in Islam, Jihad Giri Tabaqoti Islam, I mean, he mentions that he criticizes one translator who translated something from about existentialism, in which he brags about how existentialism emphasizes choice. But then Shariati says, why is this new to you? Because we do have choice in Quran, actually. The Quran is a reservoir of all of these progressive concepts. All we have to do is to interpret them, to translate them, to interpret them, to define them in such a way that they're supposed to be defined and translated and interpreted, and see if we can use them in the process of emancipation. Emancipation, of course, not from some colonial force, but emancipation from ignorance, emancipation from that condition that demands your misery, the condition that demands your degradation as a human being. So he sees religion as a force, as a movement, not as an institution. The institution belongs to the clergy. The institution belongs to the official owners of religious thoughts and decision-making processes. He looks at religion, that same religion that could be used to liberate society, provided that we have a good understanding of the concept. Now, some of the concepts in the discussion of deculturalization he uses is that the one concept that, of course, is very broad, and underneath that concept, you can find all relevant concepts related to the social condition in which that broad concept defined. The concept is off. If you were to, if it's directly from Quran. I guess a loose translation of that would be disempowerment. Okay, so disempowerment. Don't go directly to colonialism. Think about mechanisms by which colonialism is made possible. So it says off as a general category. Underneath has istihmar, a stupefaction, istihmar. Now, what is the reason for colonialism? External and internal, particularly in the post-colonial context, is first is istihmar, he says, and then second is istihmar also. So in other words, he emphasizes that deculturalization is the reason, not knowing your own culture, not knowing yourself, is the reason for domination, for practices by other people that is contrary to your or contrary to your interest. So it's interesting. He lectured once at the University of Abadan, Petroleum University of Abadan. The title of the presentation is "The Extraction and Refinement of Cultural Resources." Now, it's interesting though, because Abadan University was dealing primarily with natural resources, petroleum, et cetera, et cetera. See, he presents that. Therein, he presents the idea that we have to look at ourselves, the resources, rich resources that we have. And he also, by the way, he has an idea about how to go about. So, Dustin mentioned about revolution, the Hussein tradition, etc. Shariati believed that without any deep and all-encompassing thought process that is developed, that can address all the dimensions, a revolution, and without an alternative, a revolution will end in disaster. Okay, so anyways, I can't say anymore, but the fact is that he was emphasizing conscientization, awareness of the reality of who you are, and make sure that in the process you recognize the target of your criticism. Now, he does criticize the Western social, philosophical, ideological statements, and also oftentimes, in the form of Orientalists that they send over there in the study. And one thing that he says that we really need to be very careful how some of the narratives about us is the purpose of the narratives about us. Who says it, how they say it, and what is the context. And then, of course, he says the same thing about Western European. It says, look what colonialism is doing to Europeans themselves. He mentioned specifically Victor Hugo. He says that, in 1812, when the French decided to bomb Algiers, the capital of Algeria, he says, this statement comes at the time when humanism and specifically Victor Hugo and his humanitarian impulses, as he presented in his, in his concern for humanity, even those who were thinking about democracy and liberalism and human beings and et cetera, went to look at these bombardment and didn't say a word denouncing this bombardment. That's very interesting. So in other words, he looks at it as a broad category of class structure of society, global class structure, that these very same people that are really are defending colonialism will also really belong to the upper echelon of the society against the labor of those societies. In many ways, he's presenting the concept of social imperialism. I deal with this concept, but it's not exclusive Shariati's, but Shariati looks at social imperialism. Hegemony. How do you get along the imperial colonial power to go and do these things? How do you enable them? Well, you come up with ways of getting the general population behind it, in support of it. And that means, of course, promising them things, like they promise that this colonial tree will bear fruits eventually and will benefit the lower classes in Western Europe. And so what he's saying is that there is, the colonialism is not just has victims outside of territories of Europe, but also within Europe that we have to look at. That it is a process of dehumanizing humanity, not just Westerners or Easterners. By the way, he uses the concept, Eastern intellectuals. That is today we call global South, right? The intellectuals from the global South. Before that, it was called Third World. But now, of course, sort of we're playing with words. Global South is much more, I guess, respectful than the Third World and before that. But the Eastern that he uses is not particularly a geographic area, neither is the West as far as he's concerned, but it is the mindset. It's the mindset, certainly with this tradition and history. The Shariati encouraged his students, as Dustin pointed out, that engaging his students to think about who you are, think about not us against them, but there are other things that you can use in other cultures so you can understand your own culture better. I mean, this is something we've been saying that in sociology and anthropology and a lot. But he also warns that be careful, because language can structure your world. Language structures your world. The words that people can use can influence your behavior, and therefore they can, if it is malicious, then they certainly can impact your existence and subject to manipulation and control. So as far as the West is concerned, he says when they're telling you that they go to Africa and they're going to civilize, be careful. What civilize? What does that mean when we say civilization? Is that guns, gunpowder, and tanks, and weapons, and blue jeans, and cars? Or we're looking at something beyond those things, material reality. It is the spiritual dimension of those things and how we deal with those things as human beings. But anyways, what he, in the process of identifying the mechanism, he also identified different classes of society, different layers of society. And in particular, he was very angry with the official religious authority, more than he was angry at the Shah. Because again, for him, istihmar or stupefaction is the reason, it's the foundation of all other ills. And therefore, we don't address that. And all of those people who have much to benefit from that, then really we're not getting it. We become reactionaries. And therefore, to understand ourselves, we have to understand our culture. And that is a big responsibility. Again, Dustin pointed out, Shariati was adamant about personal responsibility, social responsibility. In fact, the intellectual that he defined is Roshan Fikr. Roshan Fikr is different than intellectual. It's not a translation of intellectual. Roshan Fikr simply means somebody who has commitment to his or her society. That's Roshan Fikr. That must build a bridge between what he called that beautiful island he lives in, or she lives in, and the rest of the people. Connect and be with them, walk with them, right? And yes, maybe if you have understood the reality better than some others, try to dictate, to communicate. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you very much, Dr. Shariati, for
Thank you.
for your beautiful talk on Dr. Shariati, the historical depiction of colonialism in Africa and the centrality of Ali Shariati's thoughts in colonialism, and your insightful explanation on SMR and other stuff. Can we lend an ear to Sayed Akhlaq, if I'm yeah, great.
Yeah, that's correct.
Yeah, please.
Okay. Hello, everyone. It's an honor to be here, and actually I learned a lot from Dustin and also Shariati. So actually, what I wanted to share with you, some reflection on Shariati's work with regard to post-colonialism. So when I was very young, I used to live in Iran, and I love Shariati. I grew up in a religious family, and my father was a traditional scholar, clergy, so he didn't like Shariati. And like all young generation, I love Shariati, and I wanted to read his books, and still I have some effect of that with my life. So, but during all my life, I tried to get back to Shariati and see if I can apply it with new information and new education that I got. And as Dustin just told us, if I can apply it to current life. So in that context, I think there are some important things that we can learn from Shariati, and there are some things that need more consideration. So first of all, Shariati was among the first intellectuals in Persian culture in Iran, Afghanistan, Tajikistan, that who talk about post-colonialism and colonialism and what effect of that and how it influenced the intellectuals. So actually, if I want to add something to what Mr. Shariati said rightly, that he was very angry at ulama or religious scholar, but at the same time he was angry on his peer intellectuals, because he was thinking that as ulama lost the spirit of religion and they misuse or abuse religion as a matter of the stupefaction or stihmar, also the intellectuals, they are lost their culture, their histories, the big asset and treasure there to renew themselves and refresh their minds. So that something that was very interesting, connected to the istimar or colonization and also istihmar. He divided istihmar into two divisions. One he called old istihmar or old stupefaction, that is most related to the ulama, that they are using religion, zuhd, asceticism, akhlaq, tasawwuf. That's the Shariat issue. Even poems, philosophy, falsafa. He was big enemy of the abstract philosopher like Avicenna. We know his famous quote about that. Even some religious idea like sawab, shafa'at, and sin. And we learn about he was against utopianism or getting back to the original, meaning that it was perfect. Of course, he didn't believe that. That was the old stupefaction. But he also talked about new stupefaction. That is something that we can learn. That's a kind of the product of the colonizations. That and it's not only for colonized people. It's because he was very affected by the Marxist viewpoint, and he thought even the Westerners themselves, they have this problem. So new means of the stupefacients are like being specialized in a particular field and be ignorant with the other field of studies, or even the industrial research that is very common in academia in many, many centers with the new concept of science. And he talks about all these kind of things. So it means that he was really an original thinker that faced and encountered crisis. We can say Shariati is the deep thinker of the crisis. And one reason that he is still alive in Persia and even in all Muslim country and around the world, because he talks about the crisis that people are facing and experiencing. So he believed in this crisis in a very broad context, is a product of the colonizations and also colonized people, because in that process, colonized people, they lost their originalities. And as I just told you, that traditional scholars, ulama, they are very stuck with the past, and new intellectuals, they are completely westernized, and they think that these can help them, the Western concept and like that. That's one thing that I wanted to mention. The second point is that he went deep into the core of the modern life and modernity. So particularly when he used the word tajaddud, that's mostly used for modernity, he doesn't like it. He is of course very progressive, and I will talk about that, particularly with rationalizing religion and all these kind of things. But still, I think mostly because he was influenced by Marxist viewpoint. So he is very into equating modernity with consumerism. Consumerism is a big problem for Shariati, and I think that's something that colonization is doing to the colonized people, and just introduce new products and keep them busy for new products and new products without knowing themselves. This is actually the link point that links Shariati as a person who actually believe in Marx, also as a person who highly respect Sartre, because in this context it goes from to kind of the existentialist viewpoint that emphasize on originality, or we can say authenticity of the people, that be yourself and don't be fooled with mass, no matter is a masses as a people. That's one of the point that Shariati has about democracy or mass media or mass production, anything like that. So he is very much against that, and that's the one thing that he highlight with and the true nature of the modernity leads people to consumerism, and that's another point that I wanted to say. And so Shariati actually is very interested in modern life. He is like a Islamic. We have different kind of Islamist group. So he is not like a people who actually believe that the nature or essence of the Western civilization has all problematic things. He believes in kind of, we say in philosophy, he look at the West as a whole, not as a universal. He doesn't believe that the Western culture has a nature, that this nature is good or evil. And because of that, he is against his peer intellectuals and his ulama, because one look at the West as the good and another as the evil. He look at the West as a combination of the elements. There are some good elements and some bad elements, and he believes that he can pick some part of that and leave other parts. And because he has a kind of a specialties in the history of religion, so I think because of his Islamic background and his belief that Islam is a Western religion. So he think there is a kind of the potential to combine Islam with Western ideology, with the positive aspect of the Western ideologies. That's actually paved the path toward dialogue among civilization and the original thoughts of the Shariati. So that's actually we can say then because he is eager for spirituality, but not in a regular Sufi viewpoint. So in the Western culture, he find Blaise Pascal as a role model for spirituality, and then he wants to combine all these three figures together, Marx, Sartre, and Pascal as a role models, and then he conclude that in Iranian culture and in Shia context, Imam Ali represents all these three characters. And so Imam Ali for him is a combination of the Marx, which regard to justice and egalitarianism, and Sartre, with regard to freedom and existentialism, and Pascal, with regard to spirituality and be connected to the metaphysics. And all of them come together to talk about Ali as the role model that he talks in his last book, Ummat and Imama, and saying, so we have Marx, Sartre, and Pascal, all of them led to Ali. So these are the fundamental concepts of Shariati that I wanted to say in the context of the colonizations. However, Shariati also has some point, one another point that I would like to highlight, and it's very, very important, his emphasis on alienations. So he discussed about this point and how in some way colonizations alienate people from their own culture, from their own self-consciousness and social consciousness and historical consciousness. When he calling upon historical consciousness and cultural consciousness and religious consciousness, he's talking against the impact of the colonialism that keep people away from that. And one thing that make Shariati more interesting, that for me, he is a kind of the ideal for domestic modernity. So he believes that there are some elements in each culture, particularly when he's talking about Iranian and Shia culture, or maybe broadly in Islamic culture, that people can take it and combine it with some Western elements and overcome the crisis. As we just talked, that he is the deep thinker of the crisis. So these are very, very positive things that I can find in Shariati, but there are some points that I think Shariati, because he was too much into finding a solution than thinking that considering different elements of things if they are consistent with each other. So there are some flaws or some negative points that Shariati actually, because he was, as I just told you, too much into the action, he wanted to bring change, so he didn't work on these points. One is that even when he talks about the Western civilization and modernities and all things like that, still he is in the paradigm of the Marx, dividing people into two groups. So oppressor, oppressed, or lord and servant, and all these kind of things. So he is still in the dichotomy, in the dualism, and he was not able actually he needed it because he was pro-revolution, and revolution means that you have evil, you have to destroy it. But that was something that caused him to do not see diversity of things. So for him, everything is good or bad. Everything is that's one thing that I think important with regard to his work. Another point is that Shariati was rightly too much for progress. In some way, we think he was affected by modernity in that extension that he was not able to see some positive things in the past. That's the one reason that many ulama accuse him, and he was aware of that, and he responded to that, to be kind of the Wahhabi, because these people are known as the people who don't believe in traditions, and they say, okay, we want to do what we want. And so there is some element, some point in that accusation. Shariati actually was too much looking forward, that his understanding, his analysis, his talking of the past, everybody could understand that they are kind of the ideological understanding of the past. When he's talking about Ali, about Hussein, about the Quran, so it mostly resonates to the people ideological Hussein, not what the Hussein was pertained in history of Islam, not what Ali was written in Islam. So actually he invented a past to benefit him and his follower for the future, not to go to the past and see what happened in the past. Because of that, because he's being to build the future. So even in some in aspect of Islamic and Iranian culture, he'll look negatively at them, that they don't deserve like that. For example, Sufism. So he was very against Sufism. Not only Sufism, even myth or asatir. So he looked at them very negatively. So because he just was trying to look at the future. And his understanding of the history of Europe and even history of the religion in Europe in some way, because he wanted to use religion in the way that he wants, was not very accurate when he's talking about the equating like Marxist people Catholicism with feudalism, or when he's saying that Protestantism is a Islamicized Christianity, or all this kind of the oversimplification of the European history. It looks like in this aspect, Shariati making this decision too fast and is not very accurate. However, as we just talked, there are a lot of things that we can learn from Shariati, and I think still, because he was concerned with the existential things, he was concerned with the justice, he was concerned with the history and domestic values. There are a lot of things that people can learn from Shariati, and of course we can learn it. That's what I wanted to share here. Thank you for giving me this time.